Evacuation. More than 100,000 men, women, and children, all of Japanese ancestry, removed from their homes in the Pacific Coast states to wartime communities established in out-of-the-way places. Their evacuation did not imply individual disloyalty, but was ordered to reduce a military hazard at a time when danger of invasion was great. Two-thirds of the evacuees are American citizens by right of birth. The rest are their Japanese-born parents and grandparents. The people are not under suspicion. They are not prisoners. They are not internees. They are merely dislocated people, the unwounded casualties of war. The time, spring and summer of 1942. The place, 10 different relocation centers in unsettled parts of California, Arizona, Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, and Arkansas.
I was born in a small town south of Sacramento called Florin. My dad had a farm. We raised grapes and strawberries. I was there until age 5 when World War II started with the bombing at Pearl Harbor. And on that Sunday, my dad, who had been home listening to the radio, heard about the bombing, burst into the Methodist church where my mother was playing the piano and interrupted the service announcing that Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor. And all of a sudden, in that one instant, our lives changed. We didn't know what was going to happen to us, and at first, there wasn't that much anti-Asian sentiment in the newspapers. Things were quiet. But after a while, the newspapers started publishing articles about the perils of having the Japanese on the West Coast. And it made the neighbors who had been friendly in the past a little afraid. And so we felt the sting of prejudice before we were sent off to what euphemistically is called internment camps, but the official government documents called them concentration camps. So Pearl Harbor occurred in December 7th, 1941, and by May of 1942, the people in the Sacramento area were being shipped out. I remember the day we had to leave. It was May 30th, 1942. It was dark when we got up. We had to be at the railroad station in Elk Grove by a certain time. And I remember I was 5 years old, going into the garden and finding my grandmother, who was in her 60s, looking at her garden and crying, saying in Japanese that she didn't think she was going to ever get back here. And I remember taking her hand and telling her, "Don't cry, Grandma. You will be back. I know you will be back here." At that point, we didn't know where we were going. We only knew we had to pack up and take what we could, carry in a suitcase. We were told to bring sheets, towels, personal items, clothes. We didn't know how long we were going to go. We didn't know where we would be sent. We just knew we had to leave our farm. Most of us were sent to what they called assembly centers. They had them all over the United States, and many of them were fairgrounds or racetracks. And that's why you hear stories of people being housed in animal barns and horse stalls. We were lucky. We got there late, and so we weren't put in one of the animal buildings. We had temporary quarters, which was a barrack that was built directly on asphalt. And I remember Fresno was hot. It was over 100. And if you sat on the bed, asphalt was soft and the bed would sink. And I remember getting tar in my hair, and my hair had to be cut because the tar was dripping from the roof. That was how hot it was. There were no trees. We were there from May until October when the real camp was ready, and we were sent to Arkansas. We were sent on a train, and the government did not want people in the public to know that we were being moved. So soldiers would come through the train and order us to close the window shades as we approached any town. And we would be sent across the nation that way. We didn't know where we were going. We had no idea of how long we would be there and what the living conditions would be like. It was another camp. The buildings were built in the order of a military facility. The terms used were military terms, so we ate at the mess hall. The restrooms are called latrines. They had a men's side and a ladies' side. Each side had 16 toilets. There were no stalls. It was just open toilets, 8 in a row, back to back. And I remember my grandmother telling me, don't sit with your elbow out because that's very impolite. And if you did, you could touch the person next to you. That's how close they were. And it was, the whole experience was humiliating. There was no privacy. There was, people were uprooted. We were chased out of our homes, and there was so much uncertainty and fear. My dad was very wise. There were some people that belonged to the Farmers Association who turned their farms over to them, but my dad found a man, Bob Fletcher, who said he would take care of our farm, sell the crop, pay the mortgage, and pay our taxes. So he did that for 3 farms, and we didn't lose our farm. That didn't happen for too many people. Not everybody in the Florin area lost their property. In each case, if you did not lose your property, there was a neighbor or someone who was a friend that helped you. 85% lost their property.
The Japanese American Archival Collection here at Sac State is arguably one of the best in the world. It may not be the largest, but what makes it so unique is the depth and breadth of the collection. It began in 1994 with a donation of educational material from Marielle Tsukamoto. Mary was a leader both in the community as an educator as well as a civil rights activist. And upon her retirement, she donated her educational material here. It tells the story from the vantage point of the evacuees, from the government, which is the War Relocation Authority, from the neighbors. After President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which legalized the incarceration of people of Japanese descent in the military zone, which was the entire West Coast. It was Washington, Oregon, California, and southern Arizona. And things moved very quickly. So at that point, the Japanese Americans were evacuated and sent to assembly centers. This illustrates how the Japanese Americans were only allowed to bring what they could carry. So here we have these 2 young girls who they could carry their suitcases. Reiko and her sister were from Hollywood, and they ended up in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. So they didn't know that they were supposed to bring warm clothing for cold weather. What it also meant is if you could only carry what you could bring, is that you can see these Japanese Americans evacuating from the Elk Grove train station, but here you can see that the mother could only carry her child and perhaps a diaper bag. So she wasn't able to bring anything besides her child. What we see here is a document from Clayton Triggs. He was the manager of the Pomona Assembly Center. Pomona was a racetrack down in Southern California, and it's Evacuee Information Release number 18. And in this document, he is talking about what families of mixed marriages should expect. And what they're referring to is that many times Caucasian women were married to to men of Japanese descent, and they were not forced to go to the incarceration centers. So they were faced with the choice of whether they stayed out of the incarceration center or if they were going to go and stay with their husbands and their families. And in most cases, as far as I know in all cases, the Caucasian wives and mothers decided to go with their families into the incarceration centers. In early 1943, all of the internees were commanded to complete a questionnaire. This is called the Statement of United States Citizens of Japanese Ancestry, but is commonly referred to as the Loyalty Questionnaire. Question 27 asks, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? And question 28 asks, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any and all attack by foreign or domestic forces? And those who answered no to both those questions were called no-no boys. They were considered traitors, and they were segregated and put into Tule Lake, which became a segregation center for the no-no boys. In December 1944, Marielle Tsukamoto wrote a Christmas card to President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt. This is the Christmas card. And if we look at how she starts out the Christmas card, she says, Dear President and Mrs. Roosevelt, from Christmases ago, we were shocked and deeply hurt to know it was Japan who started the war and left the record of shame for history. We were one of the 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast. Frightened and angry, we were eager to do our part to protect the precious shores of our America. Unbelievably, things developed, and by May, we left our beautiful grape winery and homes and friends to live in a camp. And then in January 1945, Eleanor Roosevelt did respond. And in her letter, she says, Dear Mr. and Mrs. Tsukamoto, I read your letter with much interest and I appreciate your writing. I am glad all is going well. With best wishes, I am sincerely Eleanor Roosevelt. What we're looking at here are some of the arts and crafts that were made in the incarceration centers. Working with arts and crafts and other recreational activities were key to, I believe, keeping the sanity of the internees. Tule Lake was on a dried seabed, so there were shells that they could use to make various corsages and works of art. Another aspect of the story that is told by these artifacts is that they worked with whatever they could find as well. Nothing went to waste. So here we see this beautiful doll, but if you inspect it closely, you can see that her hands are made of toilet paper that were wrapped around wire. Her body and face is made from stockings and nylons. Her hair is made from sewing thread, and her kimono is made from scraps of fabric. In this painting, this is called sumi-e. It's a form of watercolor. And what's interesting about this painting itself is that you see the image of the watchtower. During the internment period, internees were not allowed to take photos or recreate images of the watchtowers. But just as interesting, we see on the back that it was made from a Purex soap box. Here we're looking at artifacts and photographs that tell the story about the military service of Japanese Americans. Once it was determined that they could serve in the Army, the 442nd Regimental Combat Battalion was created. It was segregated and it was consisted of only Japanese Americans. Here we see the picture of 3 young men from the Sacramento area. This is the picture they took before they were shipped out, and all 3 of them were killed in action. So they died for their country while their families were incarcerated. Here we have a Sen Nimbari Vest, and it is one of our most rare items in the collection. Sen Nimbari, loosely translated, means 1,000 knots. And each of these red threads are a knot that was tied by a loved mother or family member for this vest. And the Sen Nimbari tradition dates back to samurai times because theoretically all of these knots would deflect the thrust of a samurai sword. So many of the family members created Sen Nimbari. It was usually an obi, which was a sash. But in this case, George Matsushida's family created this vest. He decided to keep it. Most other recipients of Sen Nimbari items threw it away. They did so because, as you can see, it is very Japanese looking. Here we have Japanese calligraphy, and on the back of the vest, we have this lovely painted tiger and more Japanese calligraphy. This material relates to the reparation and redress for the Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. During the Carter administration, a commission on the wartime relocation and internment of civilians was formed, and as a result of their investigations, they determined that the Japanese Americans' constitutional rights were denied and that they deserved an apology. So here we have a photo of President Reagan. He is signing H.R. 442 bill, where he is actually authorizing and legalizing the apology and redress to the Japanese American survivors. And then here we see the actual apology letter from George H.W. Bush. And in it, he says, "A monetary sum and words alone cannot restore lost years or erase painful memories." And then the second paragraph, he says, "In enacting a law calling for restitution and offering a sincere apology, your fellow Americans have, in a very real sense, renewed their traditional commitment to the ideals of freedom," etc. At the same time, the survivors received a check for $20,000. Here we have a letter from President Clinton from 1996, and he also sent a letter to the surviving internees. And what is interesting about this letter is that this was the first letter where he actually said, "We are sorry." Here we say, "Today, on behalf of your fellow Americans, I offer you my sincere apology for the actions that unfairly denied Japanese Americans and their families fundamental liberties during World War II." And it was determined by the Commission in 1983 that the Japanese Americans lost between $810 million and $2 billion in 1983 numbers, and they were never compensated for that.
My mother and father, both as American citizens, always believed in this country. And it was, I think, a vindication that we were innocent. We got an apology and some monetary remuneration. It makes it less likely that it will happen again, but does not guarantee it. That is why this collection, that is why books and materials like what my mother wrote are important, so that the next generation understands that unless you protect the Constitution for everyone, everybody is still in jeopardy.